Hey everyone, welcome to the Happy Flosser podcast. I'm so glad to have all of you with me today. My name is Billy Lunt. I am your host, and I'm really here to help you with all things dental hygiene, to support you through your journey as you go through the dental hygiene program and beyond, really. I have lots of special guests. Those are labeled help episodes. If you're new to the podcast, I have a tutor style podcast where I try to have about 20-minute conversations with you as your tutor, as your helpful source for you to just review important information. I tend to cover content where students have a lot of challenges with specific things. So if there are areas that you are struggling with, that's the content that I'll typically cover. Feel free to send me information. Say, hey, I'd really like you to cover this topic. I'm having challenges with it. I would be happy to record an episode about that. Whatever you're having trouble with, that's what I'm here to help you do. So in today's episode, I'm specifically covering the cranial nerves. I've had several students reach out to me about the cranial nerves, and even though I have a podcast on the cranial nerves, it also covers some additional content about the cranial nerves. So today's episode is literally just the cranial nerves for those students that need to just cover the cranial nerves specifically and have a memory tip on how to remember them. So there are 12 cranial nerves, and there's some that are more specific to us in dentistry that we need to know in a very detailed way. But the fact is, you have to know all 12, and it's really important for you to know all 12 anyway, where you're going to be giving local anesthesia. So it's really important for you to get a grip on how do I remember these, where are they, and how do they impact me as a clinician. Really, it's always important for you to understand how is this important to me in the clinical setting when I'm working directly with patients. So because there's 12 cranial nerves, you have to know all 12, and it's best to learn them in order. So the first cranial nerve is olfactory. And olfactory is all about the nose, the sense of smell, right? So smell. And the way I like to remember olfactory is that I can usually smell something before I can see something. So that's the first cranial nerve. So your sense of smell is your cranial nerve number one. Cranial nerve number two is your optic. And optic is the sense of sight. And so that is your second. And the way I like to remember optic is that you have two eyes, and it's cranial nerve number two. Now, cranial nerve number three is ocular. And so the ocular is the support, right? So it helps with the eyes, the muscles, the pupils, and the lens. So cranial nerve number three. So usually you need that third person in a team to help do those supportive things. So that's how I remember that cranial nerve number three is ocular. So it helps with the optic function. Cranial nerve number four is your trochlear, and your trochlear is all about your eye muscles. So I think of trochlear, I think of triceps, and I don't know if that helps you, but that helped me when I was learning cranial nerve number four. And cranial nerve number five is a really important and kind of a big deal cranial nerve for dentistry. And it's just like that song, Five Golden Rings. You know how when you get to five, it's like a big deal? Well, in dentistry, when we get to cranial nerve number five, it's a really big deal. It's the trigeminal nerve. And it has three main branches to that trigeminal nerve, the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. And you'll have to know cranial nerve number five in very great detail because it impacts the maxilla and the mandible, and that's all where all of your work occurs. So cranial nerve number five, trigeminal nerve, you will be spending a lot of time with that. So trigeminal, tri meaning three, there are three main branches to cranial nerve number five. So I like to think of the five golden rings to remember number five. Number six is abducens, and abducens has to do with your eye muscles again, but I think of six-pack abs as cranial nerve number six for your abducens, and that helped me remember that that was cranial nerve number six. Cranial nerve number seven is your facial muscles, It helps you with your expression, your sublingual and submandibular glands, all the things that have to do with the face. So for cranial nerve number 7, it's the facial nerve, and it's a really important one for you to also be very familiar with. That one is also used pretty heavily in dentistry. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear, right? So that has to do with your hearing. And it's also called the auriculotemporal, which is always so much fun when we have multiple terms for the same things. And that's just how it is when we are learning something. It gets a little more complicated for us when we are trying to learn something and there's multiple vocab words to use for the same things. And sometimes we interchange those, which makes it really confusing when you're learning. And I can totally understand that. Cranial nerve number 9 is your glossopharyngeal, and that has to do with the taste and the anterior 1/3 of the tongue. So the glossopharyngeal, you remember that What's Up commercial back in the 90s? You might not, but it's been referenced many, many times. So if you think about the glossopharyngeal as glosso, right, meaning tongue, and pharyngeal, meaning taste, and the parasympathetic part of the parotid gland, that area that will help you with glossopharyngeal. And it's number 9. I don't have a tricky way to help you remember that, but that is also a very important cranial nerve for dentistry. Cranial nerve number 10 is your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is such an amazing nerve. The more you learn about the vagus nerve, the more important it becomes in like your whole body, whole life stuff. But really the vagus nerve comes from your heart. It's the center. It controls your cardiac muscle and your smooth muscles and your glands. And everything happens in vagus, the vagus nerve. So maybe that helps you. So anything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, Vagus, VAGUS, is cranial nerve number 10. So vagus is in the center, it's your heart control, and that is where all of the important stuff happens. So maybe that will help you remember that one. Cranial nerve number 11 is your accessory nerve, and that helps with your trapezius and your pharynx and larynx. So it's an accessory cranial nerve. It's called accessory. It helps with all the accessory things. It's very important to have all those things working and functioning and having an awareness and knowledge of that particular cranial nerve. It is indirectly associated with dentistry for sure. And then the hypoglossal cranial nerve number 12 is directly associated with dentistry. That controls the muscles of the tongue, except palatoglossal, the 10 and 11, right, are there. So for hypoglossal, it helps with the muscles of the tongue. And you would be amazed at all the different things that our tongues can do, all the different movements that they have. And so that cranial nerve really supports that. And that is one of the more important nerves in dentistry. So it's important for you to know sensory, motor, or both. So if a cranial nerve is just a sensory nerve, or if a cranial nerve is just a motor nerve, or if a cranial nerve is both sensory and motor. So cranial nerve number 1 is just sensory. Cranial nerve number 2 is just sensory, right? So think about that smell and the sight. And then when you get to cranial nerve number 3, that's a motor nerve, right? So that one, it's about the eyes, the muscles, the pupils. So think about motor and what that means. It's movement, okay? So it's not just sensing things, but it's also a movement for a part. Cranial nerve number 4 is a motor nerve. That's those eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 5 is both sensory and motor. That's just a complex nerve, right? That trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve number 6 is a motor nerve. That's the eye muscle, abducens. Cranial nerve number 7 is both sensory and motor. Cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear, that one is a sensory nerve. Cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, is both sensory and motor. Think about it, it's about the taste, but it's also about parasympathetic innervation of that parotid gland. Cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, is both sensory and motor. It helps with the smooth muscles and the glands. Cranial nerve number 11 is both motor and sensory, that accessory for the trapezius, the pharynx, and the larynx. And cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal, that one is a motor nerve, meaning that it helps with the movement of the muscles of the tongue. So a little sentence that you can use that helps you remember the cranial nerve order from 1 to 12. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So if you write that sentence down and then you take the first letter of each one of those words, that will give you the first letter of the name of each of the cranial nerves. So, once one takes the anatomy final, right? So olfactory, optic, ocular, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial. Those are the first 7 words. Those are the first 7 nerves. So if that helps you to learn the list of the cranial nerves, then for sure use that to your advantage. I hope this helps you learn the basics of the cranial nerves and the basics of their functions and whether or not they're sensory or both or